Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Folk Unlocked panel. My name is Marissa Kolka. My pronouns are she, her, and I am Folk Alliance International's Communications Manager. So before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge that we are joined today by folks from various locations using technology that is not accessible to all. We recognize the importance, complexity, and difficulty of land acknowledgements in the context of online organizing, creation, and collaboration. I am grateful to join you today from Kansas City on the traditional territories and ancestral indigenous land of the Osage and Kansa, Kickapoo, and Oceti-Sakowin nations. If you'd like to share a land acknowledgement of where you're joining us from today, or to simply comment on the conversation, please do so in the chat box. If you're unsure what indigenous nations to acknowledge, you can enter your address on the native-land.ca website, which we have just posted in the chat. Finally, today's conversation is part of FAI's continued reflection on the systemic issues of racism within society, music industry, and the folk music genre, including the very structure of our own organization. As a team and community, we are committed to this conversation, as challenging as it may be at times. We invite you to join in acknowledging our shared responsibility to use this time together well, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and accomplishment. I'd now like to introduce you to our two guests to help set in context some of the issues at the center of our work as it relates to our collective understanding and view of folk music. Joining us today are artist activist Joe Siemens and Grammy Award-winning artist and past Folk Alliance board member Dom Flemons.
Thank you so much for having us, Marissa. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Dom. Nice to see you, buddy.
Yeah, man. Well, we're here for a panel that's titled Anti-Racism and Setting a New Tone for Folk Music. Well, what does that mean for you, Joe? What are you thinking about with that? I always think about in my years of moving forward in the folk community, the conversation has changed. For many years, there were a lot of scholars that were actively opening up those doors for people like myself to come along. But now the doors have been opened up. We have a lot more people with a lot more diverse voices that want to be heard. And now I find myself being a part of the journey of trying to keep those doors open and go to the next step. I feel like this is where I wanted to be from the start.
Yeah, and I feel like where we start is with acknowledgement. And so to acknowledge that we're all about the music, and we, both you through your work and a lot of people in that tradition you're talking about, we have seen the unique power of our music to help move us to a more just world, right? That's part of what folk music has been about for a long time. And the way that white allies or would-be allies such as myself have done that work has been imperfect, but that has been the intention for a long time. And as with any issue as complex as racism, the success is mixed and every approach is not effective. But thanks to the long lineage of people like yourself that have done this important work, acknowledging the complexity of the American folk tradition, those doors are now open. And so we're here to celebrate that fact, but then also talk about that the struggle is not done, right?
Absolutely. Well, it's funny that you mentioned acknowledgement, and I think that that's a great word to think about when heading forward into the 21st century fully with folk music. Because one of the things that I feel it tends to, to get lost in the shuffle is that we've come a long way since the very first folk music documentarians of the 19th century. And if we think of a lot of the folkloric work done up until, the mid 1960s, there sort of is a halfway point where the older folk music was more rooted in the 19th century, more so than the 20th century. And then even then, a lot of the mid 20th century work kind of ends around the 1980s, which is before the beginning of hip hop and rap. And I think that there's been a lot of documentarian work and a lot of research that's been done in the early 2000s up to the present. But I think that those two worlds of the old folkloric world and the new folkloric world are finally meeting in a way that I think we just have to acknowledge they've never met before, and I think that when everybody shows up in the same room, I think it's going to be it's a different conversation than I think everybody was expecting from in the first place. So I think that that's a wonderful thing. I also try to acknowledge a lot of the people who have done so much of the forensic research to create the documentation that we have now built our understanding of folk music upon. I think back on even people like, since this is a Folk Alliance panel, I think back on some of the great folklorists, like I think of someone like Chris Strakowitz, and I think of all the work that he's done with our Hooli records, and the chance to be able to acknowledge the work that he's done, as well as the musicians and the artists who he also elevated with that work.
Absolutely. And I think it's also valuable to acknowledge, as you said, the two worlds are now meeting, and we need to think about the fact that for a while, the people that were defining the term folk, it was largely people who look like me. Mm-hmm. And that has happily begun to change recently. And we need to understand that there's an evolution taking place, that those gatekeepers are finally, that the gatekeepers themselves are changing over. And when we talk about folk music, we're talking about music that is of the people. So maybe the way you and I think about these terms, as we've talked about it and worked together in the world of folk music over the years, we're thinking about music that is of the people, right? And so in that, when I think of folk music, I include music that covers the rainbow of ethnicity, experience, background. But the people that started out defining folk music largely were white men, and they applied that lens to putting boundaries on what was folk music. And so those boundaries need to keep opening up. The work of like righting the ship in terms of the academic treatment is still ongoing. And yep. So, in my role in this conversation, I thought, I was like, well, what place do I have in this conversation? Shouldn't this be occupied by someone who has been minoritized in our culture? And I talked to my wife about it, like yourself, Dom. I'm blessed to be married to an amazing Black woman. And she said, well, sometimes your role is, there's some people that are only going to hear it coming from someone who looks like you. And so that's one role that people like myself who are trying to do the work in a good way, but are struggling with, like, what is our place in this work? Because we know we need to both step up in terms of the work of anti-racism, but step back in terms of creating space for others. And some can feel that's a conflicting set of messages,
Well, without a doubt, it's been one of the other things that we're finding is a sort of a sea change is also the way that people are educating themselves in higher education. And one of the things that I guess I was fortunate in my own way was that I was able to get a liberal arts degree in English between the years of 2000 and 2005. And that was before they began to let you use computers. So
the dark ages.
A lot of my training when it came to literature, folklore, and the books that sometimes they were books that I had been that people had recommended to me, but many times they were the books that I found available when I was interested in recording and box sets like the Anthology of American Folk Music. I started to try to find books about blues or books about folk music. And that took me on not only the works of the Lomaxes, who are very well known, but even the work of Sam Charters, who was a fellow who was a poet, and he was a veteran that came to New Orleans after he had gotten off his boat, and he fell in love with the sound of New Orleans jazz. But that led him to start to study each of the parts of the blues canon, which led him to go down a path of breaking it down into regional styles and breaking the blues down into even making new recordings of contemporary artists. So he was a fellow who he wasn't satisfied with just looking at a record and saying that was this little piece of vinyl or shellac. He wasn't okay with seeing just the blank empty names. He wanted to know if there were people behind those names. And just that sort of folklore is part of the whole spectrum of the folk community that I think now in the 21st century we tend to take some of that for granted because it's just assumed that we know all the information we can about someone like Willie McTell or Gus Cannon. But there were people that went out through their own time, their own ambition to go out, find the stories, and sometimes find the people, which I think their experiences as well should also be read about because they found a lot of these blues singers in situations that I think a lot of the observers, they weren't pleased with those conditions and they took some action. Of course, this runs alongside the civil rights era. So there is a touch of the civil rights era we know through the struggles of Martin Luther King Jr. and Congressman John Lewis and those people. But there's another struggle of the documentarian trying to break away from being a completely sterilized museum observer into helping the voice of the proletariat, the singular voice that is the voice of the community that can tell the messages that may be underneath the surface of perception. And that's where we start having a different type of folklore. But of course, this is all acknowledgement so that now when we have traditionally marginalized communities being a part of the folkloric system, or they are now coming to the table at being a part of the folk community, whichever it might be, whether an academic or performance setting. I think that we have to now think of the other side of this story where there's been such a small loophole in which to create a space for these marginalized communities. Now we have to think of the loophole as becoming bigger so that each of our voices can be heard and each of them can be just as vibrant as they are supposed to be in their natural settings, and of course, with that, even saying natural setting is an anthropological term, which is also a pitfall within this story. So there's a lot of acknowledging. There's the documentarian, there's the informant, there's the way that the librarian documents it down, and then of course afterward there's the interpreter who tries to interpret this performance art and present it to a wider audience, which of course at the end of the day, if we acknowledge the love of music, if one person loves the music, we would love for other people to love the music as well. So that's something that we all should try to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And you make me think, Dom, about the fact that to a degree, with the important qualification of what was acknowledged in the introduction, that not everybody has access to this technology, we are all our own documentarians to a degree, right?
Right.
We have to do the work of making sure that everybody has the ability to do so, because not everybody has access to the tools to do so. But the technology we're using right now to have this conversation, the way that people are broadcasting folk and just music festivals in general in the era of COVID, it changes the whole equation about who is doing the documenting and how these stories get told. And so it's really a new era opening up, and we're only just starting to deal with the ramifications of that.
Absolutely. If I were to take a story of some of my early travels when I first came to North Carolina and I began to study African American string band music, in the Southern Folklife collection, they have videos of several African American banjo players that were taken on the very first video camera made available to students in 1973. And so these videos are really wonderful. But it took a lot of doing for me to go into the archives to find the videos themselves and to be able to get the money together to get the viewing copies, because sometimes that can be its own type of journey when you're getting into digging into the archives. You have to get your listening copies, you have to get your approvals and things like that. That took me around 3.5 years to be able to get all of the things that my initial research, to get everything from the library into my hands so that I could then start some of my documentary work. Nowadays, a lot of this documentation is available online. You don't have to go into the library itself. And then some of it is available online, digitized, so that access is much easier. But if I were to relate that story, I was thinking about what you had mentioned about stepping back and stepping up. And stepping back, so if we were to think of one of the last major projects that Alan Lomax was working on, it was called the Global Jukebox, and it's part of the Association for Cultural Equity, who where and that was where Alan Lomax had his residency. One of the ideas was doing exactly what you were talking about, Joe, giving documentary tools to the folk, the people themselves, so that they could document their stories their own way. Because Alan Lomax, the cultural equity for him was giving that 15 minutes in the classroom and on the stage or the television to folk cultures. Now we have the exact opposite problem because, of course, Alan Lomax was fighting against an old system that had 3 major networks, and everyone else had just a smaller transmitter that never made it to the major networks. And so that was his struggle. But of course, nowadays in the digital world, we have so much access to so much information. Now the notion is to find the places to funnel the information so that we can have targeted information going out to people. That also is good information because there are many stories through folk music's history, like any story from the United States or around the world. There are high points and low points, and there are some points that need to be reassessed.
Absolutely. And in doing that, in telling those stories, we're starting to think more critically and wisely, I think, about who is given the platform to tell those stories. You know, that's one of the things I've been very impressed at learning about the slate of things that are about to take place for Folk Alliance this year. In this digital format, there's an incredible broad range of voices that they are bringing to the table for these different panels and events. And you know, there's lots of pieces to that idea of stepping up and stepping back. Right? We have how do you exist in a space that reflects America, right? We are more and more in happily diverse spaces. But then a lot of folks like myself go back to communities that are still far too homogenous. And so, you know, how do we take what we learn in these multicultural spaces, like are being established by Folk Alliance and other well-meaning festivals? I'm thinking of Brandy Pace's project, Decolonizing the Music Room, and the Fort Worth African American Music Festival that she is launching for the first time next month. And that's where you see like the research being put into action, and then also spaces created for people to really engage in a way that is holistic, consistent with, you know, being authentic in ourselves, and then also stepping up in terms of like addressing the complexity and the pain and injustice that still exists out there. So I'm just excited to continue the conversation of if stepping back is, you know, acknowledging like I have this identity, and that means that I can play this role as we enter this new era of folk culture, then how do we step up too? What are those things that we can do that where we step up in our music and going back to our communities to push the ball forward, you know? And I think that's another interesting dimension of the conversation.
Well, I totally agree with you, Joe. And then one of the things is literally allowing us all to start to see each other for some of the triumphs that we've found over time. I mean, there are many things that need to be addressed and need to be fixed in the world, but to be able to see how far we've come socially. Again, the idea of a lens changing is one of the key elements, and thinking of the lens changing to where now we can think of these terms as distinctions instead of them being pejorative terms that we use for each other. Those are things that we can start thinking about, because of course, you know, we don't want to homogenizing our diversity is the last thing that we want to do. But we also don't want to get caught up in the same same rigmarole that we've had for many, many generations when it's come to creating terminology and that terminology going astray, but always having a sense of wanting a distinction, because that was something that I always tried to do when I was out there traveling. Was it was already inherent that I was a musician of color by being there, but acknowledging that I was acknowledged in the space as being all right. That was one of the ways that I was able to innovate in my own musical careers, just by being present. But that's something that you learn out west, especially as a person of color. Is there are many spaces where you're in, many all white spaces where you might be the only person of color. And just all my life, I've learned to be comfortable in my own skin and know that as an individual citizen, I can be a reflection of where I've come from just in of itself. And I think that that's a way to, that's something that's helped me out for many, many years, just to keep my confidence moving forward, because that can be one of the hardest things to do. But again, in stepping back, you can acknowledge who your friends are. You can acknowledge where you grew up. You can acknowledge the places you've been, because I think diversity in an individual's life can be a lot more prevalent than they may see.
Yeah, and stepping up is another piece of that is the history work that you're talking about, right? We all have an obligation, I think, to educate ourselves about where we come from, right? We have because of our happy little niche that we live in, we get to know about people like Bert Williams, or people like Eddie South, Stuff Smith, all of these all too obscure figures in our history, and Ma Rainey, who finally came to the fore with the recent film. These are people's stories that need to be out there and need to be told. And because of the way racism protects itself in our society, they have been hidden. They have been erased, and we have so much to learn from those stories. And until we are doing that work, we're not really doing the work of stepping up, because we are staying ignorant of a history that is not only informative but also beautiful. Even in its complexity.
Absolutely. And, like you bring up a perfect example with Bert Williams. Now, one of the things that he did that I'll have people just look him up sometime, and look up the fraternal order that he created with his partner, George Walker. Now, Bert Williams was a West Indian man from Nassau who performed in blackface, and he became the most famous blackface performer of the era. And as a result of his popularity, he helped create a scene for Black Broadway that led the way for the play Shuffle Along, which is a very quintessential play from Noble Sissle and U.B. Blake. But Bert Williams and George Walker, as a result of their popularity, created a group called the Frogs, who were a fraternal order of Black entertainers that were the most popular entertainers of their time. And their goal was to uplift the Negro in the arts. And the reference to the Frogs goes back to a Greek play from a poet by the name of Aeschylus. And the play is called The Frogs. And the Frogs play is about a time when Hercules goes down to the underworld to try to find the greatest poet of all time. And then there's a big showdown between all of the greatest poets of all time to see who's the greatest one. And because of that, the Frogs with Bert Williams, they created this fraternal order that would lead the way to the Harlem Renaissance. Why don't we know this? Obviously, it's a very controversial history. Many of the songs are very, very racy for their time as well as our time. And but it's one of those things that if you don't realize that there's a predecessor to the Harlem Renaissance, if you don't see that there's a history that came before some of the more well-known poets and artists, sometimes you can be left out. And especially if we're talking about traditionally marginalized communities coming forward, these are the stories that help diversify the picture that we've been told. And that in itself, I think for persons of colors, I think in terms of stepping up, just reading every book you can on any particular subject. It's not enough just to play the blues, even though you can just play the blues. But if you know something about each of the artists that you're covering or interpreting or the songs that you're playing, there is a wealth of information, and there's a wealth of knowledge that can be gained by having the personal knowledge, but then also you can find empathy with other people who also love the music. Again, it all goes back to the love of music. If you love the music, if you study the music, and if you spend time with that music, you can all of a sudden find that you can connect with people from all sorts of communities. I found that I've connected with people from 8 to 80 or even 90,
Yeah.
just by the records that I've listened to, and by the records that they've listened to, by the songs that I play and the songs that they might want to hear or play. And I think that I think there's a strength in that alone. And that is very unique to folk music in general. It's always about bringing the folk together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And another thing that you make me think of, Dom, is that stepping up and stepping back. You know, we can step up and express our emotions around the complexity of these issues and the challenge of the history, and then also step back to make space for those stories when they need to be shared. And the other point that you made me think of is you know, we have the great power of our music to enrich us and to root us more deeply in our heritage. And so I think that we have to, in contemplating the story of Bert Williams and sharing those stories as educators and as artists, we have to understand that there's a tendency to highlight the suffering of minoritized people, which is all too real and sadly ongoing. But there's also a de-emphasis then on Black joy, on the celebration and the range of a style like the blues. The whole spectrum of emotions is available and is expressed in music like blues, and yet it's cast as this sorrowful music, right? And so I think that we have to, both in the work of anti-racism and in our communities, we need to make sure that we're uplifting and highlighting the joy that is created despite that pain, despite the extreme sorrow and anguish of the experiences that have been all too prevalent in this country. And so that's something that I'm trying to do with a class I'm teaching called Face the Music, where we do like an 8-week workshop and learn the stories. It's like, yes, absolutely acknowledge and contemplate the suffering that happened here, but let's not lose sight of the transcendent act of a blues singer who is not just addressing their pain, but then transcending that pain through singing the blues to go to a higher level. Ralph Ellison talks about that very beautifully in how he discusses the music, and that's something I always try to carry as we do work of anti-racism that often is thought of as very heavy. It is necessarily a heavy task, but there can also be joy and another element of emotion brought to that work that needs to be there for it to sustain itself, right?
Absolutely. Well, it's like they say that energy doesn't completely dissipate. It just it transfers to a different place, and it turns into a different color or humor or whatnot. And I think music is one of those things that's like that. And again, and you've touched upon it, where if you're not uplifting people at the end of the performance, even if it's a sad song, there's some sort of uplift that has to come out of music. And that's something that, of course, we've been talking a lot about the blues, and blues is a perfect example of music that comes out of a shared oppression that comes from strict segregation. And it's a type of music that, even though it's talking about the relationship between men and women, it tends to have a lot of symbolic relationships that it talks about. So if you're saying, hey, baby, I'm going away one day, you may not just be talking about your woman. You may be talking about an environment or a situation in which you are going away from. And but the blues is always, like they say, is you're laughing just to keep from crying. And sometimes those type of little double phrases are what make folk music so powerful, is that you're always telling someone's story, but you're always trying to lift up an audience with that person's story, no matter what that story might be. We think of a song about John Henry. John Henry is a a song about a tragedy, but the song itself isn't a tragedy. The song is a triumph of man over machine, and that's one of the things that folk music has always it's always adhered to that sort of rhetoric. Another example I think of is the famous phrase with Joe Hill, which is "Don't mourn, organize," and that's one of the things that folk music has always thought about as well. Which is why I said at the beginning, it's a socially progressive community in a general sense. When you get a bunch of folk people together, whether it's folk music people or folk enthusiasts or people who are pro voice of the proletariat, you find that folks are getting together to help out people that are less fortunate than them. And that's an acknowledgement as well, is that many times in folk music, people are already trying and they're already willing to jump over those lines to meet with people when they see oppression and they're ready to fight. And I think that in terms of a perfect example of stepping back and stepping up is what Pete Seeger did with a beautiful little phrase that Woody Guthrie put on his guitar. So for many years, Woody Guthrie would fashion his guitar or fiddle with a little phrase that says, "This machine kills fascists." And that was a phrase that he lived by. Now, Pete Seeger, as he went along and after Woody had passed, or I guess in Woody's time of being in the hospital, Pete decided to adapt that phrase. He felt that killing fascists was a bit more extreme than fit his personal philosophy. So he wrote on his banjo and had it for all of his life, "This machine surrounds hate and forces it to surrender." And what a beautiful notion there, where he could take a phrase that was, again, a lot more of an active phrase and turn it into a phrase of pacifism that would seem just as powerful without weakening the original message. And I think that those are something that we can all think about when we're doing our interpretations or are doing our manifestations of our music,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a perfect pivot point to talk about the last kind of point that I wanted to raise with you, Dom, and that's the issue of tone and approach, right? What is are we killing it, or are we surrounding it and forcing it to surrender, right? What does that look like in taking an approach to the work of creating a more just culture as a country or as a world, and then also a more just environment in our happy little niche of folk music that we are celebrating here at Folk Alliance. I think that the thing that I took often from the Chocolate Drops and getting to spend a little bit of time with yourself and Rhiannon in different contexts is to always lead with compassion and empathy, right? Mm-hmm. We're not going to convert anyone to our belief in equality by by accosting them, right? We have to have an approach that leads with empathy and storytelling, right? That creates a common ground on which we can have a discussion. Because we have Twitter exists now. We know that just people just going back and forth, hammering each other as hard as they can. That's not really creating an environment that's of healing, of compassion, of progress. So I'm curious about your thoughts about what are other parts of the approach that we need to be taking now?
Well, in terms what's the first thing with tone and approach when it comes to things like social media, I would just one thing I would be aware of with us talking about documentation so much, when they document all of social media down, be mindful of what you say. That's always the first thing. And that can give you a lot to think about when you're in day-to-day life or in conversation. Think about the things that you're trying to say to people. Now, if you're trying to get the music, now let that be that be your highest priority. If you're trying to do the music, find that. There are many musicians who I've known that later I might hear that they have some view that is different from mine, but I don't let that be the forefront of our conversation. Because if you're trying to get the music, if you're trying to share the music, And if you're trying to get the music in the forefront, then that needs to be the forefront. And now, if you want to get into a much bigger conversation, because there's two different sort of conversations that are being had now by people. One, there's the acts of individual people. The acts of individual people, if things get if you get mad at somebody, you can always address it with them face to face. Now, if you're trying to address an entire system, that's a whole different thing. Now, sometimes a system can be much bigger than the individuals who run it. And so when it comes to thinking about the way that one might want to handle changing bigger systematic issues, one has to think with bigger systematic plans. And that is something that you have to really spend a lot of time thinking about. Well, again, if you want to use empathy and compassion, understand where you're trying to go with your new notion. And that's something that I always wanted to do in my own work. So knowing that there were stories that were connected to string bands that were within the blues, within jazz, within folk music, within country and Western music, those were stories I knew for sure were facts. And every time I approached a new community that maybe there needed to be a new conversation explored, I always tried to treat the conversation with respect for where those communities were coming from. And then by giving them their respect, I was able to say my piece, and by me doing my own homework to make sure that my piece was just as accurate as it could be, because sometimes passion isn't the correct answer all the time. Now, and I mean this in terms of factual data. And if we're talking about folk music and folk music documentation, try to make sure the facts are all there, because that's the hardest thing to do. And sometimes that can be the hardest thing to get in a tangible form for someone to be able to change the bigger systematic errors that are obstacles within one's way. And that can be sometimes, for example, my album Black Cowboys, by the time I got all the information together, it took 2.5 years to write it, because it took that long to be able to figure out which parts of the history I needed to tell, which ones were the universal story. And then also when I picked my music, I tried to make sure there was a diversity of the communities that were being spoken about. So with those notions being placed in there, I had to be able to write so that it wouldn't just seem like I was randomly writing in something into the history that, was my passion, but wasn't necessarily a fact. And that took quite a long time to be able to find the proper documentation that would take me there, because it wasn't on Google, I'll tell you that.
Indeed. Yeah, you give me many thoughts, Dom. I mean, one of them being, in that systemic approach that you're talking about, let's make sure that we're not reproducing other efforts, right? There are movements out there. There is the Poor People's Campaign, which has been going on since Dr. King helped found it. There is the Sunrise Movement, which is doing foundational work on the issue of climate change, which is inherently connected to the issue of racial equity. If you don't address one, you cannot address the other. And the other thing you make me think about in that more personal approach and not leading with your passion, does that mean don't be passionate? No, it means that a response that is based in your agitation is not going to have the desired effect. And this is a lesson that I've learned from many directions from the Black women that I have the blessing to work with. Because if you're a Black woman, you have to constantly, I have learned, hold back, because you can't, you are going to agitate people just because of the way you look and the way you are perceived. Yeah. And so you have to constantly be calculated and take a long game approach to achieve the desired effect. Because if you just come at people with your emotion and your passion, then you are never going to get the desired effect. And that is why it's no coincidence that a hero like Stacey Abrams and the amazing organizing work that she has done is a Black woman. It is necessary for her to survive in America with that identity, to adopt that approach. So I just want to say, I think that in Tone and Approach, we have a lot to learn from Black women, and I'm trying to do that work. And I encourage those in my community to do the same, because there's things that, because of the way I look, I just haven't had to learn those lessons until I started to try to do the work of racial equity, and go, whoa, this is like, I can't just come at you with my passion. It's not going to give me what I want, you know?
Well, after a certain point, people will have to take they'll have to take the post office approach, which is thank you sir for your thank you sir for your complaint. And again, this is the opposite of what you want to have happen if you have a lot of different items on the agenda to approach. And of course, some of them, one of the big problems as well is the subtleties that one community might find important and another community might not find so important, and trying to find the balance between, getting those different notions on the agenda. I would recommend to people thinking of the same notion, but in terms of sports. I would recommend Ken Burns' documentary on Jack Johnson, Unforgivable Blackness, which speaks a little bit of the same notion, where you have a boxer, Jack Johnson, who has to find the balance between the racial prejudice of the time, because if he came in too aggressive as a boxer, then they would say, oh my gosh, he's just a beast coming in and defeating these men. But if he was too passive as a boxer, and one of the things that they discuss is that he brought the subtlety of hugging and running and wearing another boxer down, which is a much longer game than just two men fighting each other, just brutally. If he was too passive and too strategic, they would say that he was he was afraid, he was too scared, and it's the sort of the same notion. And I think a lot about that when I'm going through my own journey in life as well, is that if you have a passion, you have to find where your priorities lie, or sometimes seeing where multiple passions may have a singular cause. And that's something as well, is that you can find that there are a lot of different stories that can be told in just a singular notion. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time doing, because of course, when I'm out there on the gig, we're talking about it now because we're in a panel, but when I'm out on the gig, you can't spend a lot of time talking to the audience about the context of your song, especially if you have a 3-minute song and you have a 6-minute amount of context. That after one or two numbers, the audience starts to notice the difference between the patter compared to the player. And that's something that I spend a lot of time when I'm crafting my shows or any of my performances. I think a lot about that, because you don't want the people to, look for the remote. You're not trying to get them to look around to their audience and figure out, okay, well, where's this song going? Or where's the story going? Because we also are talking about racism. We're talking about social justice. These are all very important issues. But of course, in the context of a musical performance, the music and the patter have to be able to coincide together, so that your audience, you're not pandering to them, but you want your audience coming to your show again. You want your audience passionate about the things that you're talking about. And there should be music, and the love of music should always be in the forefront of that, because even some of the greatest songs we've ever known that are about social justice, they all begin with the song.
Absolutely. It's like, people in my position now, I recommend the approach of like, you need to be a great accompanist, right? A great accompanist gets in where they fit in. They'll pop into the foreground for a minute to say like, hey, check this out. And then pop back in and support what's happening with the lead voice. Right. And so that's what I want to encourage my fellow allies out there that want to get better at this work. Like, let's think of it as, well, right now is not the time for us to star in the lead role. Right now is the time for us to figure out, how do I be the best possible accompanist I can, so that there is a solid foundation on which the leader can lead. you know. I think it's really important to contemplate all of the different lessons that our music have for the work that needs to be done in
Yep.
this time.
Totally, and I totally agree with you on that, Joe. And especially as an accompanist, again, these are things that we're going between musical notions and also with the sort of personal notions. Now, with accompanying a person, of course, some of the things as an accompanying musician you think about is who's the leader. What's the leader doing? What's their instrument? What are their strengths?
What do they want? What's their
Yeah.
priority for the song? Yeah.
And then as a great accompanist, what are the things that are missing that you as an accompanist can add without standing in front of the leader? Because that's one of the hardest things, is that especially if you're a really good player, like a good accompanist, sometimes has to do a lot, and sometimes they have to do a little. Sometimes they just, sometimes they're just a hype person that points at the lead. Sometimes they're making sure the lead is good all the way up to the moment that the needle drops. And that's kind of something that is always something to keep in mind. It's really about context, because again, you have to step back to know that. You have to be able to say, where am I? What am I doing in this musical situation? And you have to see, especially if it's in a big band, and if you're especially because you and I are both guitarists and banjoists, Joe, we tend to be in a position where as a guitarist you may need to do low notes, you may need to do high notes, you may need to do strumming, you may need to pick, you may need to do some lead, but that's all going to be based on what everybody else is doing. If you've got a nice bassist, you may not need to strum as hard. If you've got a really active fiddler, you may not need to do as many lead notes or what have you. And again, when you're thinking of jumping ahead in social progress, there are also notions like that as well. Like for me, one of the greatest things that happened for me was that I was able to start playing at the Grand Ole Opry, and that was because I got to meet a wonderful fellow named George Hamilton IV at Merlefest. And because I knew his song Abilene already, I was able to chat with him about how much I loved his music. And he and I got into a deep conversation about old folk songs of North Carolina. And because of that, I ultimately was able to get onto the Grand Ole Opry. But that was something where I was able to kind of feel where George Hamilton was taking the conversation. And then of course, as a historian, he wanted to really help heal the Opry and some of its old wounds with people like DeFord Bailey, or even some of the with Charlie Pride always got a lot of respect around the Opry, but they always around the Opry they were always wanting to open the field for more African American and more people of color in the 21st century than I think that they had ever had in previous generations. So George Hamilton, he extended the olive branch, and for me, I was able to take it without much struggle, and it was very beautiful to be able to connect with him in this sort of way, and through that, I was able to make a kinship with three Opry members: he, Little Jimmy Dickens, and Jimmy C. Newman, and that led to a lot of wonderful times at the Opry, even to this day.
Yeah. Well, Dom, it's been such a pleasure having this conversation. I guess I would just like to leave with one last plea or proposition, really, for my fellow white folk musicians out there, as we finally begin to fully recognize and celebrate the central influence of Black American music on the character and power of American music as a whole. I just want to say that there is an important place for all of us in this work, and to do that work, we need to really think about where we come from and rooting ourselves more deeply in the stories of all of America, and how and viewing how we fit there in a historical context, and connecting our history to our present, both in a personal sense and in the cultural sense that we've discussed here today. So I want to thank Folk Alliance for the opportunity to do this. And Dom, I always love chopping it up with you. Let's do it again sometime, my friend.
Absolutely, Joe. It's always a pleasure. And I want to just mention to folks that people like Joe,
whichever way I am,
people like Joe asking the questions and wanting to break down the barriers are also wonderful people to know. And I think that questions are always important. And I think as there are more people that are stepping up in the world, that are being brought up into the world, acknowledge the people that are also helping to open those doors. We're all opening together.
Thank you so much, Dom. Thank you, Joe. It was really, really wonderful. This conversation will continue to be available as a recording on the Folk Unlocked platform all week. Please take a moment to provide feedback on today's conversation by posting in the chat. And finally, Folk Unlocked is made available at a pay-what-you-can price point thanks to the generosity of our donors. If you would like to support our work, donations can be made at folk.org/donate. Stay safe and connected, everyone. Thank you so much. We'll see you later.
All right.
See you.